Once again, on behalf of Karnataka State Law University and Vidya Vikas Institute of Legal Studies, I heartily welcome you, sir, for this webinar. Please, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to one and all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible, sir.
Yeah. I am deeply privileged and really happy to address this elite gathering. I know this program has been organized as part of celebration of Constitution Day. The topic assigned to me is Judicial Review, a Historical Perspective. To understand the concept of judicial review, it is necessary to know as to how this concept evolves. I want you to all to undertake a time travel with me, at least to the 13th century AD. Let us first land in England. At the time, England was ruled by King John. We all know, in a political system of monarchy, all the powers, the legislative, executive, and judicial, vest with the king. Rex non potest peccare, the king can do no wrong, is the principle followed then. Like all other kings, King John does have a powerful army. However, he suffered repeated defeats in a series of wars to defend Britain's land in Western France. Eventually, it resulted in internal rebellion between the king and group of barons. Archbishop of Canterbury, Mr. Stephen Longton, attempted to make a peace between the king and the group of rebel barons. The king has no other way except to settle this issue, and therefore he agreed to give certain rights and privileges to the barons. Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Longton, drafted a royal charter which was given assent by the king on 15/6/1215, which is popularly known as Magna Carta Libertatum, Great Charter of Freedoms. In short, we used to call as Magna Carta. This is the first constitutional document ever emerged in the history. A council consists of 25 barons was set up under this charter to implement the charter. However, neither side stood behind their commitments, and therefore the charter was annulled by Pope Innocent III, which leads to First Barons' War. The charter was again reissued after the death of John by his son Henry III in 1216. The said document was reissued again and again whenever the king made financial crunch, and I don't want to elaborate those aspects at present owing to the paucity of time. One thing I want to impress upon the audience is that the council which constituted under this charter only gradually, pardon?
Yes, sir. Go on, sir.
One thing I want to impress upon the audience is that the council constituted under this charter only gradually paves the way for the evolution of parliament in Great Britain. And the parliament assumes greater powers and the authority of the king reduced to the one as figurehead. The sovereign immunity enjoyed by the king hitherto was replaced by the parliament. The Crown Proceedings Act 1947 abolished certain privileges enjoyed by the crown, and for the first time it allowed civil actions against the crown to be brought in the same way as against any other party. This puts an end to the sovereign power of crown or king in the United Kingdom. The parliament becomes supreme and it can do and undo. This is how the concept of parliamentary supremacy came into realm in the history of United Kingdom. The prerogative powers of the king transferred to parliament, and the House of Lords used to exercise the same through their King's Bench. This is how the power of issuing prerogative writs like writ of habeas corpus, quo warranto, prohibito, mandamus, and certiorari landed at the hands of the judiciary. In India, the power of issuing prerogative writs was imported by the British by the Regulating Act of 1773. You all know the Supreme Court was established at Calcutta under the Regulating Act of 1773, and the Supreme Court is empowered by the letters patent to issue prerogative writs. A similar Supreme Courts were established at Madras and Bombay in the year 1801 and 1823 respectively. You all know Madras, Bombay, Calcutta are all known as presidency towns. These Supreme Courts were established only at the presidency towns, and the Supreme Courts were established in all the three places were replaced by the High Courts under the High Courts Act 1861. Though subsequently High Courts were established in other parts, they did not have the power to issue writs. Only the High Courts in the presidency towns enjoys the power of issuing prerogative writs. It was the position till India became independent. In the independent India, the founding fathers have given us the world's most living document called Constitution, in which Article 32 empowers the apex court to issue directions or orders or writs, including writs in the nature of habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, and certiorari, whichever may be appropriate for the enforcement of any of the rights conferred by Part 3 of the Constitution. And Article 226 empowers the High Courts to issue directions, orders, or writs, including writs in the nature of habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, and certiorari, or any of them for the enforcement of any of the rights conferred by Part 3 and for any other purpose. Article 32 can be enforced only as against the state as defined under Article 12 of the Constitution, whereas Article 226 can be enforced as against any person or authority, including in appropriate cases any government within its territories. In effect, the writ jurisdiction of the High Court is wider than the Supreme Court. This is one part of the aspect which we are dealing with. You all have it on one side of your mind. Now, I am moving to another aspect of the concept. To understand this, we have to again make a time travel to the America and to switch over to the American history. We all know on 29/5/1453, the Constantinople, the present day Istanbul, the capital city of Byzantine Empire, was captured by Ottoman Empire. The Europeans tried to find out a sea route for India. Columbus, who led an expedition to India, unexpectedly landed at West Indies, which paved the way for discovery of America. The discovery of America was followed by colonizations of America. There are several European colonies were set up at America, which we know today as United States of America. Between 1775 to 1783, there were originally 13 colonies. Those 13 colonies of America fought against the Great Britain, which was known as American War of Independence. And on 3/9/1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed between Great Britain and the United States. They are all history, and I don't want to delve more into those aspects. What is more important for our discussion is the Constitution of the United States of America. The 13 then colonies of Britain now become free. They want to constitute a confederation of independent states among themselves under the umbrella of United States, but they are very particular and want to preserve their independence. Therefore, they felt a need for federal structure of the governance in order to regulate their interstate trade, commerce, and water course. In fact, the Article of Confederation established a firm league of friendship, which they want to preserve, and at the same time, they want to vest more power in Congress of the Confederation, which needs a clear demarcation of powers between the independent states and the Federation. There comes the idea of written constitution. We all know the Constitution of England is an unwritten one. They are bound by the conventions, constitutional conventions, whereas though the United States are the colonies of Britain and other parts of European countries, they want a written constitution to make a clear demarcation of powers between the states and the Federation. The founding fathers of the United States of America preferred a shorter constitution for them, which originally contains only 7 articles, and so far only 10 amendments were made. The said 10 amendments prescribed certain fundamental rights for its citizenry and were collectively known as Bill of Rights. Thus, for the first time in the history, Bill of Rights attains constitutional status. Following this example, our founding fathers of the Constitution introduced a chapter for fundamental rights in our Constitution, that is in part 3 of the Constitution. If we go through the American Constitution, the first 3 articles of the American Constitution speaks about the separation of power between the 3 organs of the federal government, namely legislature, executive, and judiciary. We all know the concept of separation of power propounded by Montesquieu. In America, the legislature means Congress and Senate, executive means the president and his subordinate officer, and the judiciary, as usual, the Supreme Court of Federal, State, and other courts. The Constitution of the United States of America does not speak expressly about the power of judicial review. However, the American Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, traced this power of judicial review in William Marbury versus James Madison, Secretary of State of the United States, reported in 5 U.S. 137. I repeat, John Marshall in William Marbury versus James Madison, Secretary of State of the United States, reported in 5 U.S. 137. In fact, Chief Justice John Marshall has traced this power from the oath administered to the judges to uphold the Constitution and declared Section 13 of the Judiciary Act 1789 is unconstitutional to the extent it purports to enlarge the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court beyond that permitted by the Constitution. And he declared that it is the role of the judiciary to interpret what the Constitution permits. The said decision is revered by everyone for upholding the principle of constitutional supremacy and popularly cited as the case that saved the Constitution. See, now I narrated 2 scenarios. One is that the emergence of Magna Carta, and a council is appointed under the Magna Carta to implement it. This council paves ways for Parliament, and Parliament becomes supreme gradually, is one scenario. The another scenario is that the colonies of the America has fought with the Great Britain, obtained independence, and they established a written constitution. In that written constitution, the separation of powers was demarcated, though there was no scope for judicial review in the constitution. The judiciary in United States traced that from the oath. So this is the both scenarios we must have in our mind before going to Indian scenario. Now, let us come back to Indian scenario. Though the founding fathers did not intend to constitute India into a true federal state and adopted the parliamentary form of government like British Parliament, considering its diversified culture, they felt the need for a written constitution that declares certain rights fundamental to every citizen and issue certain directives to the government to adopt certain principles to adopt while framing its policies. So our constitution is blend of both the things. We have just seen what are all the concepts emerged from British and the concept emerged from America. So we made our constitution into a blend of both. One side, we have given ourselves a written constitution, and on the other hand, we retained the parliamentary form of government. Apart from that, they preferred the principles of constitutional supremacy rather than the parliamentary supremacy. So the founding fathers felt it is required for Indian scenario that there should be a written constitution and the constitution must be a supreme one rather than the parliament. To uphold the supremacy of the constitution, unlike the American constitution, our constitution explicitly confers the power of judicial review to the constitutional courts, namely the Supreme Court and the High Courts, by Article 13, 32 and 226 of the Constitution of India. The source of power of judicial review can be traced in Article 13. I read Article 13 for the benefit of the audience assembled. Laws inconsistent with or in derogation of the fundamental rights. This is what Article 13 speaks about. All laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of this constitution, namely the pre-constitutional laws, insofar as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, means part 3, shall, to the extent of such inconsistency, be void. So, we can divide the Article 13 into two. Article 13.1 talks about pre-constitutional laws. As per Article 13.1, all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of the constitution, that means pre-constitutional law, are void if it inconsistent with part 3 of the constitution. The part 2 makes a negative covenant on the state's power, which reads, the state shall not make any law which takes away or abridges the right conferred by this part, means part 3, and any law made in contravention of this clause shall, to the extent of the contravention, be void. So, Article 13.1 deals about pre-constitutional law, and Article 13.2 deals about post-constitutional law. That we must bear in our mind. Article 13 clearly declares that all laws, whether pre-constitutional or post-constitutional, are void to the extent of its inconsistency with part 3 of the constitution, that is fundamental rights. Article 13 makes it very clear that the constitution is supreme and not the parliament, because the legislative power of the parliament is supreme in UK, but in America, as we see in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court declared, no, parliament is not supreme, the constitution alone is supreme. Since we adopted we preferred constitutional supremacy rather than parliamentary supremacy. Therefore, Article 13 clearly declares whether it is a pre-constitutional law or post-constitutional law are void to the extent of its inconsistency with part 3 of the constitution, that is the fundamental rights. Further, Article 13 makes it very clear the constitution is supreme and not the parliament. The constitutional courts can declare any law passed by the parliament as unconstitutional if it is found to be inconsistent with any of the provisions of part 3 of the constitution. In Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, AIR 1973 SC 1461, the Supreme Court defines judicial review as the power vested in the High Courts and the Supreme Court to decide about the constitutional validity of the provisions of statutes. If the provisions of the statutes are found to be violative of any of the articles of the Constitution, which is of the touchstone for the validity of all laws, the Supreme Court and the High Courts are empowered to strike down the said provisions. In short, we can say judicial review is nothing but judicial restraint on the legislative and executive organs of the government. Now, a big question arises: how this principle operates? In abstract, we can talk about this void and the pre-constitutional law, post-constitutional law. It will void to the extent of inconsistency and all. But we must understand how this principle will operate in the field of law. For this, we must understand there are 3 principles we must bear in mind to understand the exercise of power of judicial review. While exercising the power of judicial review, the courts used to presume the constitutionality, which gives rise to certain doctrines. See, first of all, the court must presume that the statute is constitutionally valid. It must be very slow in setting aside a legislation by saying it is unconstitutional. Bearing this concept in mind, the Supreme Court has evolved certain principles. So one of these principles is doctrine of severability. What is doctrine of severability? Doctrine of severability means if the offending provision or part of the statute is severable, then it alone can be declared unconstitutional and not the entire statute. In any law, if it is challenged on the question of constitutionality, the court must see whether the entire act violates the part 3 of the Constitution or some parts alone violates the infringes the fundamental rights. If some parts alone infringes the fundamental rights, and it can be separable from the entire act, then the courts can declare those parts alone as unconstitutional and not the entire statute. This is the one principle. So the another principle we must bear in mind is that doctrine of eclipse. Doctrine of eclipse means the law or part of law which is inconsistent with the fundamental right is not void ab initio, but it is overshadowed by fundamental rights, and once the inconsistency is removed, it will come into effect. See, doctrine of eclipse means like the eclipse in the astronomy, the fundamental rights will operate as an eclipse or overshadow the provisions of a pre-constitutional law to the extent of the inconsistency with the part 3 of the Constitution. Once this eclipse is removed, then the act will come into force and the voidity will be removed. So this is how the doctrine of eclipse will operate, and it applies only to pre-constitutional laws. In Deepchand versus State of UP, AR 1959 SC 648, I repeat, in Deepchand versus State of UP, AR 1959 SC 648, in Mahendra Lal Jain versus State of UP, AR 1963 SC 1019. Deepchand versus State of UP, AR 1959 SC 648, Mahendra Lal Jain versus State of UP, AR 1963 SC 109. The Supreme Court refused to apply this doctrine of eclipse to a post-constitutional law. This is the earlier view. However, in State of Gujarat versus Ambika Mills, the Supreme Court has applied this doctrine to post-constitutional law too. So now that this doctrine of eclipse is applicable even for a post-constitutional law. The third concept which we must bear in mind while applying this concept of judicial review is that doctrine of reading down. We all know there are clear demarcation of powers between the three organs of the state. One is legislature to legislate, the executive is to execute the laws, and the third, judiciary, is to interpret and adjudicate the laws. This is the separation of power. No doubt there is a checks and balance between each organs. One of the checks and balance in the three organs is vested with the judiciary is the judicial review. It is not the duty of the court to supply words to a legislation. The duty of the courts is to adjudicate and interpret the law what it is. However, there is a slight deviation from this concept whenever the constitutionality of a statute is challenged. This doctrine is called doctrine of reading down. The doctrine of reading down or a precasting the statute can be applied in limited situations. It is essentially used firstly for saving a statute, for being struck down on account of its unconstitutionality. Whenever a question arises about the constitutionality of a particular statute, the court must try to save this statute. This principle is an extension of the principle called when two interpretations are possible, one rendering it constitutional and the other making it unconstitutional, the former should be preferred. The unconstitutionality may spring from either the incompetence of the legislature to enact the statutes or from its violation of any of the provisions of the Constitution. The second situation which summons its aid is where the provisions of the statutes are vague and ambiguous, and it is possible to gather the intention of the legislature from the object of the statutes, the context in which the provision occurs, the purpose for which it is made. However, when the provision is cast in a definite and unambiguous language and the intention is clear, it is not permissible either to mend or bend it, even if such a recasting is accorded with good reasons and consents. In such circumstances, it is not possible for the court to remake the statute. It is only duty is to strike down and leave it to the legislatures if it so desires to amend it. If the remaking of the statutes by the courts is to lead to its distortion, the course is to be scrupulously avoided. So we must understand this concept not to make law. It has to be applied only in a limited circumstances whenever the court needs to supply some words in order to save the legislation. It is not for bringing up a new legislations. If the languages are very plain and unambiguous and the court should not supply the words to the legislation, it should strike down if it infringes any of the fundamental rights guaranteed under Part 3 of the Constitution. This concept has been applied in Delhi Transport Corporation versus DTC Mazdoor Congress, AR 1991 SC 101. This concept of doctrine of reading down is first applied in Delhi Transport Corporation versus DTC Mazdoor Congress 1991 AR SC 101. Recently also, this concept has been applied in Navtej Singh Johar and others versus Union of India, and the Supreme Court has read down section 377 IPC by applying the principles of reading down. Now that we have to understand one more aspect of Article 13. In the context of Article 13, what is law? Article 13.3 defines what is law insofar as it relates to Article 13 and Part 3 of the Constitution. As I said earlier, there are two parts in Article 13, 13.1 and 13.2. 13.1 deals with pre-constitutional law, 13.2 deal with post-constitutional law. So in this scenario, we must understand what is law. What is law is defined under Article 13.3. If you read Article 13.3, it reads like this. In this article, unless the context otherwise requires, law includes any ordinance, order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom, or usages having in the territory of India the force of law. Laws in force includes laws passed or made by legislature or other competent authority in the territory of India before the commencement of this constitution and not previously repealed. Notwithstanding that, any such law or any part thereof may not be then in operation either at all or in particular areas. If you put it simple, Article 13.3 bring it in its ambit all forms of law, be it may be a law, ordinance, order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom or usages having force of law in the territory of India. This class 3 is very wide and covers all kinds of law without any limitation. However, an interesting question was raised before the Honorable Apex Court, whether the law defined under class 3 of this article includes a law amending the Constitution. You know, there are legislative powers are vested with the Parliament, state, and 7th schedule deals about 3 lists. One list is state list, second list is concurrent list, third list is union list. These 3 lists are in 7th schedule. So the Parliament and the respective state legislatures are competent to enact legislation based upon this competency on the subjects enumerated in the each of the lists. The state is empowered to legislate upon the state subjects mentioned in state list. The union is empowered to legislate upon the subjects mentioned in the union list. Insofar as concurrent list is concerned, both the state and the union can legislate upon each other. These are all the legislative competency of the state, which is prescribed and dealt with in union legislature and state legislature separately. Apart from that, there is one article which empowers the Parliament to amend the law. That article is Article 368, which gives powers and procedure for amending Constitution. Now the question arose, whenever the Parliament exercises this power under Article 368, it is a constitutional power. It is not the legislative power as adumbrated in either of the union list or in the state list. This is the power conferred upon the Parliament under the Constitution to amend the very same Constitution. We all know the difference between a rigid Constitution and a flexible Constitution. Our Constitution is a blend of both. In some places it is very rigid and some places it is very flexible. However, whether this power, this constitutional power, by exercising this constitutional power, if the Parliament has enacted any law, whether it can be subjected to judicial review or not, is the question raised before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Sankari Prasad versus Union of India, AR 1951, SC 458, held that law does not include constitutional amendment made by Parliament under Article 368 of the Constitution. The said decision was followed by the majority view of in Sajjan Singh versus State of Rajasthan also. Sajjan Singh versus State of Rajasthan reported in AR 1965, SC 845. AR 1965, SC 845. It followed the earlier decision of Sankari Prasad versus Union of India, AR 1951, SC 458. However, in IC Golaknath versus State of Punjab, reported in AR 1967, SC 1643, the Apex Court overruled its earlier decisions, of course, prospectively, and declared that the law amending the Constitution also a law within the meaning of Article 13.3. The IC Golaknath is the first case which introduced the doctrine called prospective overruling. We all know all the legislations are prospective unless it is declared retrospective. But all the precedents, judgments, decisions are retrospective unless it is declared prospective. However, considering, suppose if the particular law is declared which affects the earlier decisions, the Supreme Court can prospectively overrule it. This doctrine has evolved only in this IC Golaknath case reported in 1967 AAR SC 1643. Now that Supreme Court has declared that the constitutional law, also a law, it is subject to judicial review. It put the Parliament into a great embarrassment. Therefore, to abrogate the above declaration of law, Parliament made an attempt to exclude the judicial review of the laws, amending the Constitution, and introduced Clause 4 to Article 13 by way of 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which reads as follows. They brought in a particular clause to exclude the powers of the court to judicially review any constitutional amendment made by the Parliament by invoking the power under Article 368. The clause 4 reads as follows. Nothing in this article shall apply to any amendment of this Constitution made under Article 368. So the attempt is very clear that the Parliament don't want to review its constitutional amendments by the constitutional courts. The validity of the 24th Amendment was questioned before the Honorable Apex Court in most celebrated case. We all know Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, AR 1973 SC 1461. In this Keshavananda Bharati's case, what happened? The Supreme Court has overruled the decision of the Golaknath case and upheld the validity of the 24th Amendment. But curiously, what happened? Though Supreme Court has confirmed the validity of 24th Amendment, it has brought in a new theory called basic structure theory. Supreme Court declared that certain principles, certain objectives are fundamental. They are very basic, which forms part of the constitutional ethos. So these basic structure should not be affected. So they gave a fetter to the Parliament to amend the Constitution that they should not alter the basic structure of the Constitution. This is what called basic structure theory of the Constitution. However, Even in this Kesavananda Bharati's case, the power of judicial review vested with the constitutional courts found to be one of the basic features of the constitution. Since the power of judicial review is declared to a basic structure of constitution, the parliament cannot bring an amendment in a way curtailing the power of the courts to review the legislative and administrative action. So now that the law is well settled, law includes all laws, including the constitutional amendment. If the constitutional amendment is challenged on the question of validity, it can be reviewed to the extent whether it affects the basic structure or not. So this is what the court can do by exercising the power of judicial review. Now the moot question is how the courts can review the legislative and the judicial actions of the government under Article 13 of the Constitution of India. As I said earlier, the high courts in the presidency towns and Kolkata were already entrusted with the power of issuing prerogative writs, and the Constitution of India extended the same to the Supreme Court of India under Article 32 to enforce the fundamental rights, and all the high courts under Article 226 to enforce the fundamental and other rights. So earlier, before independence, only the high courts have the power of issuing prerogative writs and not the other courts. The high courts in the presidency towns like Madras, Bombay and Calcutta, but other courts have no such power to issue prerogative writs. Now that by bringing in constitution, this power is vested with Supreme Court under Article 32, but Article 32 can operate only insofar as to enforce the fundamental rights, and all other high courts under Article 226 to enforce not only the fundamental rights but also other constitutional and statutory rights. The other question which may crop in our mind is who can invoke these provisions? Whether anybody can invoke these provisions. No doubt, the above provisions can be invoked by the persons aggrieved. So the basic concept is that any person aggrieved, any person's rights is infringed, they can very well approach the court. For that only the courts are exists. In legal parlance, we used to call it as a locus standi, which means the right or capacity to bring an action or to appear in a court. So the first question which would raised in a court is, what is your locus standi to bring this action? This is the traditional view. This above traditional view of locus standi was also relaxed by the Apex Court in Mumbai Karmakar Sabha versus Abdul Dai, reported in AIR 1976, SC 1455. Mumbai Karmakar Sabha versus Abdul Dai, AIR 1976, SC 1455, which paves the way for public interest litigations in India. In SP Gupta versus Union of India, reported in AIR 1982, SC 149, AIR 1982, SC 149, the Honorable Supreme Court declared that any member of the public or social action group acting bona fide can invoke the writ jurisdiction of the High Court or Supreme Court seeking redressal against violation of legal or constitutional rights of the person who, due to social or economic or any other disability, cannot approach the court. Therefore, the traditional view of the person who has locus standi to approach the court has been relaxed insofar as it relates to the infringement of fundamental rights are concerned. Therefore, any public spirited person can approach the courts for any public cause, especially for the welfare of the weaker section of the society. For the question, is there any form prescribed? My answer would be an emphatic no. The Honorable Supreme Court in Bandhua Mukti Morcha versus Union of India, reported in AIR 1984, SC 802, treated a letter addressed to it as a writ petition. There are several instances where letters, telegrams, and postcards were treated as public interest litigation. To name a few, I can cite some of the decisions which you all know. People's Union for Democratic Rights versus Union of India, Ubendra Bakshi versus State of UP, Alga Delhi versus State of Maharashtra, Sheila Barsi versus State of Maharashtra, Nyanshyam Pardesh versus State of Tamil Nadu, Veena Sethi versus State of Bihar, Khadija B versus State of versus Superintending Engineer Salal Hydroelectric Project, Ramkumar Misra versus State of Bihar, Neeraja Chaudhary versus State of MP, Lakshmikant Pandey versus Union of India, Janagi versus Sardar Nagar Municipality. So I cited all these citations just to show that there is no strict form for approaching the apex court or high court for the violation of infringement of any of the fundamental rights. It is always felt that the procedure is handmaiden of the justice, and cause of justice can never be allowed to be thwarted by any procedural technicalities. Though there are criticism about this power as judicial overreach, no one can undermine the benefits reaped due to judicial activism. Only by this judicial activism, we come across many reforms, many social reforms. I can say prison reforms from Sunil Batra, Sheila Barshi, and there are health-oriented things like Hossain-Ara Khatun, which makes the fundamental. It's a fundamental right for every citizen to have hygienic medical treatment, which is declared by the Supreme Court under Article 21. So you all know the interlink between Article 14, 19, and 21, and these interplay, though in A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras was not expounded properly, in Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, this interplay between Article 14, 19, and 21 is well accepted. And now that Article 21, no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty without procedure established by law, has become a due procedure established by law. In Maneka Gandhi, the Supreme Court expounded procedure is not mere procedure. The procedure must be just, fair, and reasonable. Like that, the Supreme Court has declared life means dignified life. Like that, liberty means not only personal liberty attached to the body, but liberty attached to all kind of human life. Only based upon these principles of judicial review, the Supreme Court has brought in many social reforms. I can say even the polluters pay principle. See, in so many series of MC Mehta cases, MC Mehta is a public spirited lawyer who has approached the Honorable Supreme Court many a time for bringing in non-polluting atmosphere. So there are so many series of cases filed by MC Mehta. In all these series of cases, the Supreme Court has evolved the principles called polluters pay. What is polluters pay? The person who pollutes has to pay for its reparation. So these are all the good things has happened by the principles called judicial review. So as I said earlier, though there is a separation of power between three organs of the states, legislative, executive, and judicial, there are checks and balances among them. The judiciary, who is declared to be the watchdog of the Constitution, has to jealously guard the Constitution and its constitutional ethos. It is true that there are criticisms about its power as judicial overreach, judicial activism, but no one can undermine the benefits reaped due to judicial activism. The constitutional courts, namely the apex court and the high courts, are the watchdogs of the Constitution, and they have onerous responsibility to guard the constitutional ethos given by the founding fathers. The power of the judicial review still keeps a most living document, and the democracy survives only because of this. We all know in neighboring countries the democracy has gone, and even in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, we have seen there are collapse of constitutional mechanism. However, in our country, because of this power of judicial review, which is vested with the constitutional courts of our country, protected, well protected, this most living document of the world's largest democracy. With this short note, I conclude my lecture. Thanks for the wonderful opportunity given. Thanks for the passion hearing. If you have any doubt, you can raise your questions.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there are certain questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shahnaz madam, please pose the questions, no? Shahnaz madam, kindly unmute yourself. Sir, I'll read out the question.
Okay.
Is judiciary overstepping and undermining the power of legislation and executive in the nature of judicial review?
I said no. This allegation every time it crops in. There is no clear distinction that there is no watertight arrangement where it exceeds. One may call it as a judicial activism and one may call it as a judicial overreach. The thing is that we must give importance to the constitutional ethos. We declare ourselves that constitution is supreme, not the parliament or any other executive. So the main duty of the higher judiciary is to declare what is law and what is under constitution and what is not constitutional. While interpreting the constitution, it becomes the duty of the apex court or high courts to make the document, the constitution, a more living document. To that extent, they are giving certain directions, they are issuing certain directives only to protect the constitutional ethos and constitutional objects propounded by our forefathers, which we cannot term as constitutional overreach. I can say it is only a judicial activism which should be welcomed by everyone.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the lie detector test, whether it should be constitutionally valid.
It is already declared, no, in Selvi versus State of Karnataka.
Yes, sir.
The involuntary lie detecting test is declared unconstitutional, and voluntary administration is possible, and you must get informed consent. That is what Supreme Court held in Selvi versus State of Karnataka.
Sir, there is one more question.
That emerges from your state, no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Student have asked the question like that. Sir, there's one more question. Whether the basic structure is an illusion because it's not specifically defined by the court as a, what are the things that can be a basic structure is what one more question is.
See, while interpreting law, we must have so many aids. We have to read the legislation as a whole, whether it is a constitution or ordinary legislation. If it is a constitution, we must understand its principles by reading it as a whole. If we read the constitution as a whole, we have more salient features than other countries, like fundamental right under part 3, directive principle of state policy under part 4, and the distribution of legislative powers between state and center, and judicial review, writ jurisdiction of the apex court and high courts. These are all put in every chapter of the constitution. If one understand these principles, then they can very well understand the concept of basic structure. So this is what the Supreme Court propounded in Keshavananda Bharati. You cannot take away this. If you take parliamentary form of government from the constitution, then the entire constitution will fail. Our founding fathers have bring us these objects with noble objects, these concepts with noble objects. So we must understand the objects behind every structure. The constitution is not mere a constitution of a firm or thing. It is a constitution of the state. So if you take away any of the principle or any of the structure, then the entire constitution will shake. So we devised in such a way. So these salient features is inbuilt in the constitution. That is what propounded as basic structure. So it is not an illusion. It can be easily understandable by reading it again and again.